The auctioneer's voice was a metronome with a mean streak, ticking off the last pieces of Maya Langley's life. Each crisp syllable sounded like a hammer dropping on the lid of a coffin, neat and final, sealing away what her family had built across 3 generations. From the back of the sterile, overlit auction room, floors scrubbed to a soulless shine, air stinging with disinfectant and desperation, Maya stood as if she were a ghost at her own family's funeral. The stainless steel fermenters that had once hummed a hopeful lullaby, the spectrometers and precision mixers, even the heavy wooden sign with the gold leaf script, Langley Therapeutics, were itemized and offered, tagged and taken, devoured piece by painful piece, by a crowd of sharp-eyed bidders who smelled a carcass on a winter road. For a fleeting moment, as the auctioneer paused to sip water and the room buzzed with whispers, a foolish, reckless hope fluttered through her, like a moth confused by the sun. Maybe some benevolent figure would stand, sweep up the assets, and hand them back. Maybe someone would remember the scholarship clinics, the free drug programs her grandfather ran, the way her father used to say medicine wasn't about margins, it was about mornings, patients waking up to another day. But hope, in that room, was an endangered species. The next lot was announced, and hope fled. Her mind jolted backward, unspooling to the headlines from 3 months back. A nightmare reel of corporate warfare. Cross-medical engineers executal takeover of Langley Therapeutics. Dr. Julian Cross, a name she'd never uttered until it was etched into her bones, had been surgical in his assault. He didn't just outplay them, he unmade them, with the calm brutality of a man disassembling a watch. He had bought their debt for pennies, shorted their stock with a gut-punch press leak, and bled them dry with flawless timing. Brilliant and monstrous in one breath, he hadn't merely defeated her family, he'd dismantled them like a structure whose weakness only he could see. A sharp, strangled gasp from her aunt pulled Maya back to the fluorescent present. Her father, Wilson Langley, always proud in a modest way, the man who kept a folded picture of his late father in his wallet and carried the weight of kindness on his shoulders, was folding into a chair. A security guard, big as an oak in a navy suit, helped him down. His face had gone the color of unbaked dough, a sheen of sweat at his temples. His hand pressed hard to his chest, like he was holding a door against a storm. The fall of his company was becoming the failure of his heart. The days that followed were a motion-blurred montage of cold benches and warmer hands, of antiseptic-stung hallways, and the soft shuffle of shoes that never stopped. The hospital smelled like rubbing alcohol and the underside of rain clouds, and it wore on her until every breath came flavored with fatigue. Her father survived the heart attack, blinking up at her with watery eyes and a soft apology he didn't need to give. But the prognosis clung to every whispered update. Grim. He needed surgery, complicated, costly, and the family's insurance had vanished into the same black hole as their balance sheets. Bills arrived like wolves. The registrar spoke in exact numbers with the gentleness of a guillotine. That's when the shark circled back. The man in the charcoal suit arrived with cheeks so clean-shaven they shone, and eyes the color of winter steel. He introduced himself with a card that smelled faintly of ink and money. "I'm here on behalf of Dr. Julian Cross," he said, and the air tightened like a pulled string. "Dr. Cross is prepared to extend a final merger agreement," he continued, voice untroubled by the grief scrawled across Maya's face. He slid a leather-bound contract across the dull plastic of the waiting room table. It thumped down like a verdict. "We have nothing left to merge," Maya said, her mouth dry as paper. "On the contrary," the man replied smoothly, "Dr. Cross is prepared to absorb all outstanding debt of Langley Therapeutics and personally oversee your father's care. Entirely. Best cardiothoracic team in the country. Immediate scheduling, no waiting." The words were a lifeline thrown to a drowning swimmer. They flashed brilliant, life-preserver red. Hope lifted its reluctant head again. Maya felt her heart flip, like a coin refusing to fall. But she knew men like Julian Cross did not dole out miracles. They structured deals with needles hidden in the seams. "And in return?" she asked, her voice a thin wire stretched too tight. The lawyer opened to the final page and pushed it forward with polite precision. "The primary asset," he said, looking her in the eye in a way that made her feel appraised rather than seen, "is you." Maya stared down and the room swayed. It wasn't a merger agreement. It was a marriage contract, dressed in the tidy language of assets and consideration, dates and terms. The walls tilted, the air thinned until her lungs were nets trying to catch water. He wanted to marry her. The man who had raised her grandfather's legacy, who had put her father into an ICU bed under the eerie lull of machines, wanted to fold Maya into his empire like a final, gleaming acquisition. White-hot hatred thundered through her, so powerful she could taste metal on her tongue. She imagined shredding the contract into confetti and setting it on fire. Imagined the smug line of the lawyer's mouth collapsing under a hard slap. Then she imagined her father's pulse skittering under trembling fingers, the way he tried to say her name and failed. She imagined a funeral. The pen weighed almost nothing. It burned like a brand in her hand. She signed where she was told, each letter a betrayal that bruised. When she slid the contract back, she didn't look at the lawyer. She stared out the window at New Avalon's skyline, a city of cold glass spires, where people like Julian Cross ate people like her for breakfast and asked for seconds. "I will be your ruin, Julian Cross," she whispered to the glass, the words so small they could have been prayer or poison. "I will live in your house, and I will dismantle your empire brick by brick, smile by smile, from the inside." The wedding was a transaction executed with the swift sterility of a hospital discharge. It happened in a judge's chambers that smelled like paper and old pretenses. Dark wood, dusty law books, a flag in the corner that looked tired of all the oaths it had overseen. Maya wore a simple white dress she'd bought on the clearance rack, the only dress that didn't feel like she was lying outright. Julian wore an impeccably tailored navy suit that fit his tall, controlled frame like a secret. He stood beside her with the stillness of a sculpture, his face scrubbed of anything human. The judge mumbled the ceremony like an incantation nobody believed in anymore. Maya's "I do" came from so deep in her that it might as well have been dragged up by a winch. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Julian didn't look at her. It was like watching a door close in a dark house. One you know leads to the basement. Outside, the world was a carnival in teeth. Cameras flashed and bit at them. Voices pitched to high, hungry registers as reporters lobbed questions like grenades. Publicists had planted the seed, and it had grown into a riot of headlines. The papers would scream about a fairy tale union, a merger of bloodlines and billions. The city's newest power couple. Two families made one. "Smile, darling," Julian murmured as his arm slipped around her waist. The endearment was silk with a vein of steel running through it. "The world is watching. Your performance determines your father's comfort tomorrow." Maya's back stiffened. She smiled anyway, all teeth and light, a blazing, brilliant lie. Her hand flattened against the smooth fabric of his suit jacket, feeling the solid plane of his chest, steady as a wall. They posed like a magazine cover, all symmetry and shine. Only her eyes told the truth. They were ice chips when they met his, and the frost burned. Julian drove them himself. His car, low and predatory, ate up the city streets in a hum like a held note. He didn't take her to a home. He took her to a fortress on a hill in Summit Heights, a temple of glass and steel, angles so cruelly beautiful they made your breath hitch. It stared down at New Avalon like a hawk. Inside, the air was cool and fragrant with something expensive that smelled like cedar and clean intent. Their footsteps echoed over slate and polished oak, the house so wide it made her feel like a lost child. "Your rooms are in the East Wing," he said evenly, gesturing down a hallway that looked like it might end in a horizon. "Mine are in the West. A full staff is at your disposal. A card, no limits. Use it." He paused before a set of double doors with ironwork that looked like vines. "In return, you will be presentable, discreet, and convincing. This is you." He left, and the absence of him was a vacuum. The East Wing was an apartment trapped in a dream of opulence. There were floor-to-ceiling windows that drank down the skyline. A marble bathroom big enough to lose your grief in. A bed that looked like a cloud had been nailed to the floor. It was gorgeous, and it had no soul. A gilded cage, airbrushed and ice-cold. She drifted through it like a sleepwalker, touching nothing, feeling everything. Mrs. Julian Cross. She said it under her breath like a curse just to hear how bad it tasted. By evening, she moved like a diver descending. She showered until the water ran cold, pulled on a simple silk nightgown that felt like moonlight on her skin, and waited for the kind of loneliness that sounds like silence. She expected him to ignore her, expected to be left there to marinate in humiliation. That, she thought, would be the last efficient act of dominance. Marry her, set her aside. At exactly 10, the bedroom door opened. Julian stood in the doorway, light bleeding around him from the hall, his features composed but tight at the edges, like a man holding something in. "We need to talk," he said, calm, measured, deadly. Her heart slammed against her ribs, an animal that wanted out. So this was how it would be, ownership stated plainly. He walked in, and even the air seemed to make way for him. He stopped a few feet from her and studied her not like a man looking at a woman, but like a specialist looking for anomalies in a scan. "Take off the robe," he said. 4 words, clean and cruel. Not a request, a command. The last lock snapping open. Maya's blood iced and boiled in the same instant. She lifted her chin, fingers working at the knot of silk at her waist with a steadiness she didn't feel. She wouldn't cower. She would not give him that. She let the robe slide off her shoulders and pool at her feet in a soft surrender she did not mean. She stood straight in the nightgown, the hem brushing her knees, her arms bare and her eyes blazing like a lighthouse no storm could swallow. She waited for the leering, the smirk, the lazy inventory of his new asset. He did none of it. His eyes were not hot, they were sharp, assessing, clinical. His attention narrowed like a camera lens locking focus just below her right shoulder. He stepped closer, and she flinched, not because she was afraid of his touch, but because his nearness threatened her composure. He didn't touch her, he lifted a hand to point. "There," he said softly, intensity coiled in the word. "That." Maya glanced down at the place he indicated. A tiny silvery line, barely the length of her thumbnail. She'd had it so long she barely saw it anymore. "A scar from a fall," she said, sarcasm dipping into her tone like a match into gasoline. "Is this the part where you inventory my imperfections?" "That's not from a fall," he replied, ignoring the barb. He dropped his hand, but his eyes didn't leave the mark. "It's a keloid, a very specific tissue reaction. It's a marker." Her patience snapped. "A marker for what, exactly?" He finally lifted his gaze to meet hers. His eyes were darker than they had been all day, and something like sorrow flickered through them. "A failed clinical trial," he said. "Your father's company ran one about years ago. A drug called cardionics." The name hit her like a fist to the solar plexus. Cardionics. The ghost in their house when she was a kid. The word whispered through shut doors, the way her father's voice went tight. The project that one day stopped existing, a file that never came up again, a failure they never spoke about, wrapped in a silence that smelled like guilt. "How could you possibly know that?" she stammered, her defiance slipping through her fingers. "Because I've spent 5 years and more money than is decent chasing it down," he said, voice turning to tempered steel. Cardionics was revolutionary. It showed early brilliance in preclinical. But in late human trials, a subset of patients developed a dangerous, at times fatal side effect, cardiac destabilization, that was preceded by the appearance of those exact keloid scars at the injection site. He took another step, and his presence felt like a storm front moving in. "Your father didn't report. He buried. He paid families, he swore physicians to silence. He shelved the project and hid the evidence to avoid the scandal that would have finished him." "No," Maya whispered. The word was a lifeline she couldn't find a grip on. Her father, who fell asleep in his office chair because a patient's med schedule crossed lines on his planner, her father would never. "Your father did," he said quietly, but with no gentle in it. The truth didn't need volume, it needed weight. And now a rival of mine, Damon Vale, has somehow acquired the stolen buried data. He thinks he's found a miracle. He's rebranding it as Vascarin, rolling it to a fast-tracked approval, betting he can thread a needle without seeing the blood. Pieces snapped into place in Maya's mind with vicious clarity. The takeover, the dismantling, this obscene marriage, it wasn't random. It was all connected like a map of a city under glass, tunnels feeding into the heart. He held her gaze, and for the first time she saw not a conqueror, but a soldier sent on a mission no one else could see. "I didn't marry you for your name," he said, voice low enough that the house itself might have leaned in. "I didn't marry you for revenge. I married you because that scar makes you the one living, breathing, undeniable piece of evidence of what cardionics did. You are the key to proving Vascarin is a loaded gun before Damon Vale can put it in pharmacies across America. You are not my prize, Maya." He paused, and the room held its breath. "You are my secret weapon." He turned and walked toward the door, leaving her standing in the center of a hurricane with no walls. Her carefully curated hatred toppled like a tower of cards, blown over by a wind she hadn't accounted for. Her plan to ruin him seemed small against the scale of what he'd just laid at her feet. At the door, he looked back. "What I've told you tonight doesn't leave this house," he said. "Get dressed. We have work to do." Morning arrived like a stranger. Maya hadn't slept. She sat at the window of her gilded cage and watched the city wake. Lights blinking out one by one, a pale wash of gold on glass, a gentle hum rising into the air. Her father, a man stamped from integrity, was a fraud. Her marriage, a grotesque theater, was a strategic alliance. Her own body, skin and scars, was a piece of evidence. Hope flickered in the corners, meanly, whispering this could end in something like justice. Loss stalked it, reminding her what it had cost. Julian was waiting in his study. The room was a cathedral built in praise of discipline. Books squared to edges. Desk empty, save a sculpture like a question mark and a single black pen. It felt like him, organized, minimalist, formidable. He gestured to the chair opposite. "I've compiled everything," he said, sliding an encrypted tablet across the desk. "Cardionics, Vale. The original trial participants I've been able to identify. Cross-referenced with hospitals and clinics. I need your eyes. You grew up in that world. You'll see what I missed." His tone had turned clinical overnight, senior partner to junior associate. In telling her everything, he'd built a new wall, professional, impersonal. Last night she'd been a weapon. This morning she was a colleague. They worked. They dissolved into the quiet choreography of two people who needed each other's minds more than they'd admit. The silence punctured only by the gentle tap of her fingers on glass, the low hum of his voice on phone calls that sounded like conversations with people who made big decisions in very clean rooms. She was acutely, unfairly aware of him, the crisp scent of cedar and citrus, the cadence of his speech when he was trying to convince someone it was their idea, the way his hand slid through his hair when impatience danced at the base of his skull. He was the man who wrecked her family, who now controlled her oxygen. He was also the man who had just handed her the map to dismantle a monster worse than him. Pages scrolled, data sheets piled, chemistry compounds, redacted files, names blurred as if time could hide them. It was an arid, clinical narrative of wrongdoing, until Maya opened a subfolder labeled Personal. Inside, a single scanned document, a death certificate. Dr. Nathaniel Pike. Cause, sudden cardiac arrest. She clicked into another file, a draft of a eulogy in Julian's precise hand. It didn't read like a speech for a colleague. It read like grief made articulate. Nathaniel Pike had been Julian's mentor, the man who stepped into a father-shaped hole when Julian was barely more than a boy. He had taken him to rounds, walked him through anatomy labs, laughed humbly when Julian asked questions with too much heat. He had believed in drugs like cardionics for what they could do if made safely. He had believed in a world where hearts didn't betray. The last piece clicked into place with a solemn weight. This wasn't just about outmaneuvering a rival or exposing a corporate lie. This was personal. Deeply, dangerously personal. Julian Cross wasn't just avenging a failed compound. He was avenging the man who had taught him to hold a heart in his hands like it was glass and God combined. Maya closed the folder quickly, a thud of guilt in her chest. He hadn't meant for her to see that. It was a tear in his armor, and through it she had glimpsed a wounded thing. The cold, calculating monster had a broken organ of his own. She said nothing. Her opinion of him tilted again, the ground shifting under her feet. The summons came a week later, ushered in by Mrs. Whitaker, Julian's housekeeper, who wore her sternness like a medal. An embossed invitation, thick and cream, delivered with a smile that was not a smile at all. Vivian Cross, Julian's mother, the matriarch of the Cross dynasty, whose tongue had been rumored to slice metal, was hosting a dinner to meet her son's surprise bride. "Attendance is not optional," Julian said as he walked into Maya's sitting room without knocking. He was already in a dark suit that looked like it had been stitched directly onto his posture. "She will be looking for cracks. You don't crack." There was the faintest glint of amusement in his eyes. "Our story is a whirlwind romance. Charity gala, instant connection. You fell for my devastating wit." "Did I?" Maya asked, one brow lifting, the ghost of a smile threatening, despite everything. "We'll let my mother believe what she needs to," he said, reaching for his watch. "The press has already written our script. We'll simply perform it like it's true." Cross Manor in Hawthorne Park made Julian's glass fortress look like an experiment. The ancestral home was all ivy and secrets. The dining room, long as a small runway, was a museum of old money, portraits whose eyes followed you across the parquet, a table that had heard 100 power plays disguised as toasts, silver polished so bright it pretended not to remember blood. Vivian Cross's gaze was narrower than the tip of a fountain pen and twice as sharp. "So, architecture?" she asked coolly, barely tasting her soup as if culinary pleasure were a weakness. "An interesting calling for the partner of a medical CEO." "On the contrary," Maya said calmly, meeting Vivian's gaze with a polite light that did not flare into defiance. "We both build. We both understand how a single flaw, invisible at first glance, can bring down the entire structure." The double meaning landed. Maya felt Julian go still beside her, a stillness that meant surprise he carefully didn't show. The questions continued in a steady fusillade, probing about schools and friends and charity work and how quickly they fell for each other. There was grace to the interrogation. There was also teeth. The final question was the most dangerous, and Vivian delivered it like a surgeon would a scalpel. "My son is difficult," she said, leaning forward. "Driven, often to his own detriment. Women tend to misunderstand him. What do you admire most about him, Maya?" Silence settled over the table like velvet. Julian's jaw tightened a fraction. He was ready with an answer, a charming deflection. He didn't have to use it. Maya lifted her eyes to Julian's face as if he were the only man in the room. "His passion," she said evenly. "People see the CEO. I see the man who will skip sleep and forget to eat if he thinks he can cure something that kills. The conviction doesn't come from ego, it comes from loss. He is relentless not because he likes winning, but because he hates grief." The truth hung there, soft and heavy. For a heartbeat, even Vivian Cross seemed to consider something like respect. Julian looked at Maya as if he had expected to see a knife, and instead found a key. On the drive home, silence sat between them like a live wire. "How did you know?" he asked finally, a roughness in his voice he hadn't meant to reveal. "That it was personal?" Maya turned her head, a small, triumphant smile touching her mouth. "I pay attention, Julian. Respect. The reluctant kind that changes everything because it has no choice," settled on his face. For a moment, they were equals in a room where power usually sat only on one side of the desk. It shifted something subtle between them. He began asking for her opinion in meetings that mattered. He listened, really listened, to her analysis of the old Langley network, which doctors still held grudges and which owed quiet debts, which clinics would see more than money. He made a joke one day, dry and almost charming, and it shocked them both. But more time together meant more friction, more late nights at the edge of exhaustion, their shoulders brushing as they leaned over the same paragraph. Tension braided with the mission until it pulled tight. Maya felt the aura of a migraine creep up like a bad omen, jagged lines shimmering at the edge of her vision, a drumbeat behind her right eye that got louder every minute. She excused herself, claiming air, and fled to the dim coolness of the east wing. She lay back on the bed with a cold cloth on her forehead, the room floating a little as if she were in a boat and the sea was getting rowdy. There was a knock. "Maya?" "I'm fine," she lied, her voice small in the dark. "Just a headache." Julian opened the door anyway. He stood in the soft light from the hallway, a gray aurora around him, and the CEO left his voice. "Headaches don't make your hands tremble," he said gently. He crossed to the bedside, didn't turn on the lights, didn't make the room harsher. He sat on the edge of the mattress, and his weight was a reassurance her body accepted before her mind could protest. "Migraine?" She nodded, and the movement sent a knife through the right side of her skull. He disappeared and returned with water and 2 pills, touched by a cold sweat that wasn't hers. "Non-drowsy triptan," he murmured. "It'll help. Close your eyes." He replaced the cloth after dipping it in ice water. He didn't leave. He moved behind her and sat close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her back. "This might help," he said. And then she felt his hands. Warm? Sure. Vaunted by a kind of professional intimacy that should have frightened her, but didn't. He found the knot of tension at the base of her skull with the precision of someone who knew anatomy like poetry. His thumbs moved in slow, steady circles, pressing and releasing as if coaxing grief out of stone. Relief came soft at first, and then all at once, like a tide turning. Maya let out a sound that wasn't quite a sob, wasn't quite a prayer. He worked the line of her shoulders and the place just behind her ear that made lightning flicker behind her eyes. It was still a doctor's touch, practiced and professional. It was also unspeakably tender. "You have a surgeon's hands," she whispered, eyes closed, voice blurred by relief and something warmer that pooled low and heavy. Steady, but gentle. His hands stilled for a heartbeat, as if she'd found a nerve. When they resumed, something had changed. The pressure held a new edge of caution, aware, careful, wanting not to cross a line, and desperate to cross it all the same. His thumb brushed behind her ear, and it was a caress or a symptom of one. The air thickened, curdled with a charge that pressed against skin. He pulled away suddenly, as if he'd remembered something in a language only he spoke. "Rest," he said, voice roughened. He stood and left in a silence that felt disappointed in both of them. The room cooled, and the places where his hands had been ached with absence. The migraine had cracked. Something else had cracked too. Something inside her. Something she hadn't known was even a wall until it showed her the bricks. By the next week, the fragile awareness between them made the house feel smaller, not larger. They were careful. They became polite where once they were efficient. Their eyes slid off each other in hallways like magnets reversed. The charity gala for St. Augustine's Hospital arrived like a test designed by a cruel teacher. They had to go, optics demanded it, and they went, dressed like the kind of couple that makes people question their own posture. Maya wore a midnight blue gown that made her look like a secret worth keeping. Her hair was a soft sweep away from her face. Julian's hand at the small of her back was possessive enough to look plausible and steady enough to make her wonder where the acting stopped. The ballroom at the new Avalon Grand glittered. Money sparkled. People smiled with the hard kindness of people who had learned the rules and liked playing them. During a lull, Maya saw a face from another life. "Oh my God," she breathed, warmth unspooling in her like a ribbon. "Is that Bennett Hale?" "Dr. Bennett Hale," Julian corrected softly, more out of habit than scold. "Cardiologist. Stellar trajectory." "We studied organic chemistry together," Maya said, her smile brightening so suddenly it made Julian's stomach do something it didn't usually do. Wobble. "I haven't seen him since." Bennett spotted her. His face lit like a switch had been flipped. "Maya Langley! I could pick that laugh out of a crowd anywhere, he said as he came toward her, disarming and easy. He hugged her with familiarity that assumed the years were merely pages you could turn backward. You look incredible. I heard you married the big boss, he teased lightly, nodding at Julian with genuine respect. Congratulations. They slipped into conversation like a favorite song, late-night study sessions remembered with affection, lab disasters shared and made funny by time. For a moment, Maya forgot she was Mrs. Cross, forgot Vascarin and vengeance, forgot the prying eyes and the stage. She was just Maya. She laughed, touched Bennett's sleeve as if the memory needed a tether to the present. She didn't notice Julian go quiet. He didn't speak, he watched. His smile vanished, his posture tightened like a wire in winter. His eyes fixed on Bennett's hand, where it rested casually on Maya's forearm, and then slid away without hurry. Possession and jealousy are cousins that wear each other's clothes. He couldn't tell them apart, and it infuriated him. "Darling," Julian said, voice smooth as a blade's back. "Dr. Peterson asked for you. We shouldn't keep him waiting." He didn't wait for her answer. His arm wrapped around her waist and his hand pressed, firm enough to leave a memory. He pulled her away from Bennett so cleanly, so completely, that Bennett blinked at the negative space where she'd been. In a shadowed alcove behind a pillar smothered in white roses, Maya shifted out of his grip. "What was that?" she hissed, her whisper loaded. "You are my wife," he said, voice low enough to leave no echoes, jaw clenched. "Your attention, in public, should be on me." "Unseemly?" She laughed once, harsh and quiet. "We were talking about a broken condenser and a bad professor." "That wasn't optics, Julian. That was possessive. You looked like you wanted to throw him off the balcony." "Don't be absurd," he said sharply. But the lie didn't make it to his eyes. "Were you jealous?" Maya asked, stepping closer, daring him to call a thing by its name. Silence is an answer, if you listen hard enough. The mask cracked, chaos flickered in the spaces it left. Julian Cross, cool, clean, control incarnate, had felt jealous over another man's hand on his wife's arm. It was a revelation that left them both breathless and terrified. They went home with something raw pulsing between them. The house's vastness did nothing to absorb the tension. It amplified it. The east wing became a safe house. The west wing became a fortress. In the middle, somewhere, the almost touch at the edge of the migraine and the jealousy in the alcove collided and made the floor list. They worked on the case because work was a trench you could crawl into when the bullets overhead sang of other wars. Late in the evening, buried under files and the blue glow of screens, they hit a wall. Circumstantial evidence lined up like devoted soldiers, but the general was missing. They needed the irrefutable, something that tied Damon Vale directly to the theft, to the knowledge, to the intent to sell danger as medicine. "This is pointless," Maya snapped, flinging a file so it landed with a slap on the polished desk. "We're chasing our own tails." "He's too smart." "No one's that smart," Julian countered automatically, but his pacing had turned feral. "There's a weak link." "There always is." "Maybe it's in your plan," she fired back. Exhaustion and jealousy and fear steeping her words until they were stronger than she meant. "Maybe you're not as in control as you pretend." He stopped and turned. "And maybe you're not as committed as you claim," he shot. And it was an ugly thing for him to say because he knew it would land. "Maybe some part of you still wants to protect your father's name, no matter how dirty it is." "How dare you," she whispered, fury trembling in her like a wire that wanted to sing. She stood. "I gave up my life, my name, my freedom for this. For you. And you stand there in your glass castle, playing God and insisting you don't feel?" "Feel nothing?" he roared. 2 strides and he was right there, heat rolling off him, grief and wanting and anger cutting lines into his face. "I have to watch you every day and treat you like a chess piece when I want to—" He cut himself off, as if the truth had sprinted ahead and he wasn't sure he could catch it. "You are the most arrogant, infuriating, controlling man I've ever met," she snapped, all hurricane now, no call my. "And you," he said, his hands lifting to grip her arms, a touch not rough but not soft either. are the most stubborn, maddening, and entirely captivating woman I ever had the misfortune to meet on a day I needed to be sane." Silence crackled. Their gazes dropped, his to her mouth, hers to his. The anger twisted and became a different heat. It climbed through them like a vine. He leaned in. She rose to meet him. Her hands fisted in the collar of his shirt. The world narrowed until there was only 2 inches, and the electricity filling them. The siren ripped through the house with the rude insistence of a bad joke. Red lights strobed in the hallway. A recorded voice declared a fire no one could find. The moment shattered. They jerked apart, as if the alarm had reached into their bodies and pulled. Julian swore under his breath and stalked to the wall panel, fingers flying, jaw clenched so hard it could have cut stone. "It's a false alarm," he said, voice flat with fury. "The system needs recalibrating." But the damage was done. The opportunity was gone, stolen by a noise, an insult, a machine trying to keep them safe. The house went quiet again, like it was holding back laughter at their expense. The silence afterward was louder than the siren. It was the sound of a promise pushed into a box. "I should go," Maya said finally, a tremor in her voice that had nothing to do with fear. She fled to the east wing like a woman outrunning a tide. The next days were worse than fighting. They were silence. The case stalled, dead on a desk as if the lack of a kiss could kill a mission. The mansion turned mausoleum, and they haunted it like polite ghosts, nodding across a distance that felt like 100 miles and a quarter inch of glass. Hope refused to die. It lay there, quiet, under all that loss, breathing faintly. It made her chest ache. It made her want to do something reckless and holy, like tell the truth. She packed a bag. She told herself it was temporary, just an absence to clear her head, but the way her hands shook called her a liar. She found Julian in his study, staring out at the city as if it were a chessboard full of men he had to move to save one boy. A glass of whiskey sat untouched. He didn't turn. "I'm leaving," she said. Her voice surprised her by sounding steady. "I can't do this. The arrangement, the case, the pretending, I'm done." He turned slowly. Resignation was carved into the lines of his face, so deeply it looked like it had always been there. "I know," he said quietly, and the gentleness in it cut her more cleanly than a shout would have. He didn't argue. He didn't remind her of the contract. "I have controlled everything I could control," he said, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration that made him look younger and more human. "I plotted for years, but not for you." He took a step forward into the space between them that had become a foreign country. "This was supposed to be clean," he said. "You were supposed to be a weapon, and then you would be free, and I would go back to my cold, orderly life." He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see every caution he'd ever learned. "It's destroying me," he said, his voice dropping to a truth he had been withholding from himself. "Pretending you are just a piece on the board. Pretending my heart doesn't stop when you walk into a room. Pretending that nearly kiss wasn't the only thing I've thought about all week. Confession is a kind of surgery. The pain is sharp, and then something is lighter." "I can't do this anymore," he whispered, and he meant something else entirely than she had when she'd said it. "This lie, this pretense. I fell in love with you, Maya." The words were the ones she had hoped for and dreaded, the ones that rearranged the architecture of her chest. "I fell in love with my brilliant, stubborn, infuriating wife," he said, and his voice broke on the last word. "I broke my rules. I lost control, and I am terrified." Maya stared at him, her defenses dropping like old weapons too heavy to carry further. She could build a bridge to the truth, or she could walk away from it and spend years wondering if it would have held. "How can I believe you?" she asked, her voice a small, quiet thing between them. "Everything started with a lie, Julian, a game. How do I know this isn't another move?" "You don't," he said, painful honesty threading his words. "I've given you reason to distrust every syllable. I built this cage, and I have no right to ask you to sit in it. The mission can be over. Vale is dark. He knows nothing, and we can stop. Your father's care is endowed. Your family name will be quietly cleared when it's safe. You owe me nothing." He stepped back deliberately, carving space into the air, releasing pressure like a physician handling a valve. "I don't ask you to believe my words," he said. "I ask you to feel what's been true in this room for weeks." He didn't touch her. He didn't reach. He waited like a man at an altar no priest had blessed. He put the choice in her hands and lowered his eyes, a surrender that weighed more than any conquest he'd ever engineered. Maya crossed the distance, fear unspooled with each step. Doubt softened. She stopped in front of him and reached up. When her palm touched his cheek, he flinched like the contact hurt and felt good, and he wasn't sure which would win. He leaned into it like he was starving for such a simple thing. "Julian," she whispered, and then she kissed him. It wasn't the furious half-hope that had almost happened. It was deliberate. A yes more binding than any contract she'd signed. It was acceptance and apology and challenge. It said, "I see you, the man, not the monster, the loss, not just the win. I'm not afraid." He kissed her back with a desperation that loosened the knot in her chest and tied others in places that were not her chest. His arms wrapped around her as if they had a right to be there. The kiss deepened into something that felt like a vow born in a study instead of a chapel. It rearranged the house. The fortress became a sanctuary. They still had a mission, but now they were a team, not just allies. Their strategy sessions ended with laughter and long kisses across papers smudged by coffee and fingerprints. He trusted her with more than plans. She trusted him with more than anger. Hope bloomed in impossible corners. It smelled like citrus and ink. It sounded like keyboards and low voices, and the small, contented sounds people make when they're finally warm. Damon Vale didn't forget them. Men like him didn't let go. They watched for the sound of your breath to change. Julian's quiet assaults had crippled Vale's cash flow. Vascarin was his last bet, and he was eager, almost frantic. He didn't know why Julian had come for him so ruthlessly. He didn't know Maya's skin carried the map to his ruin. His private investigators brought him something deliciously ugly. They found out about Wilson Langley's fragile health and the discreet, lavish care paid for by a private trust tied to Julian Cross. Vale didn't understand the truth, but he didn't need to. He saw leverage. A man calling himself Mr. Smith visited Wilson's rehabilitation clinic one afternoon. He claimed to be an old colleague who wanted to pay respects. Damon Vale knew how to soften his voice until it slipped into ears and congealed there. He spoke of the tragedy at Langley Therapeutics, the vultures like Cross who fed on the weak. "It's awful," Vale said, shaking his head like he was grieving. "Your daughter, forced to marry the man who destroyed everything. One wonders what kind of care such a man might arrange for his father-in-law. Convenient, isn't it? How treatment can be used to quiet loose ends." He sowed terror with the patience of a farmer and watched it grow in Wilson's thin chest. He murmured about experimental protocols, about consent misunderstood, about treatments that took more than they gave. He left, smiling. The call to the mansion came fast. Wilson's voice shook so badly it made the phone tremble in Maya's hand. "You have to get out," he pleaded. "He's trying to kill me. He's poisoning me. He'll poison you next." Maya's stomach turned to ice. She knew the hand behind the voice. She went to Julian's study and found him dark as a gathering storm. The strategist in him uncoiled first. "He wants to divide us," Julian said, voice cold and precise. Then the doctor rose. "Your father is frightened. Fear becomes its own pathology in his condition. We can't fight this with lawyers," he said gently. "We fight it with truth." That evening, they went to the clinic together. Julian didn't arrive as a CEO or as the son-in-law who bought surgeries. He came as a doctor. He brought no contracts. He brought charts. He brought a tablet with 3D renderings of Wilson's heart that spun in delicate, terrifying beauty. He sat at the bedside for 2 hours. He explained every med, every dosage, every decision. He didn't speak about business. He spoke about arteries and ejection fraction, about how the therapy strengthened muscle, how blood moved like a river and could be persuaded, with patience and a little science, to flow more kindly. Every paranoid question was answered with patience that tasted like humility. Maya watched from the doorway and felt pride crack her sternum open. He was a healer, not because his hands were steady, but because his voice was. He did not bully the fear, he tended it. By the time they left, Wilson's eyes were no longer wild. He looked from the scan to Julian's face and saw something soft there he hadn't known to look for. A tear slid down his cheek. "You're really trying to help me," he whispered. "Yes, sir," Julian said, voice so gentle a window could have opened. "I am." It didn't just win over Wilson Langley. It cemented something in Maya that had been trembling. Love, inconvenient and real. Hope, defiant and new. The last crumbs of their old roles, captor and captive, villain and victim, blew away in that sterile room. They were a team, and they were going to end this. The final piece arrived from a place that smelled like dust and old glue. Maya had taken to sleeping with boxes of Langley archives open on the couch, digging through the history of her own name to find ways to absolve and avenge at the same time. Tucked deep into the appendix of the original Articles of Incorporation, she found it, boring legalese that lit like a fuse. A contingent liability clause, standard-looking, easy to overlook, unless you were desperate. It stated that any shelved product later found to have concealed evidence of harm would, upon any attempt by another entity to patent or market derived compounds, trigger the full and unredacted release of original research data to the FDA. Her grandfather, ambitious but decent, had planted a failsafe, a ghost that would blow open the truth if anyone tried to resurrect a wounded thing for profit. Damon Vale, in his hurry and greed, had never known it existed. "This is it," Maya said, voice trembling with more than excitement as she shoved the document toward Julian. "This is checkmate." They didn't go to the press. Julian's victories were so elegant, they sometimes felt like blessings. He arranged a meeting in neutral territory, a hotel suite so bland it was almost spiritual. It was just them and Damon Vale, whose confidence arrived before he did and evaporated as Julian said nothing at all. Julian slid the clause across the table, with the casualness of a man offering a napkin. Damon read it, color drained from his face like someone pulled a plug. He read it again, and his hands shook because sometimes a well-written sentence is more dangerous than a gun. "What do you want?" he rasped. "It's very simple," Julian said, voice softened by clarity. "Tomorrow morning, you'll announce that due to complications in the final testing phase, you're permanently shelving your miracle. You'll sell the IP and all related research to a private trust I control for $1. And then, Damon, you will disappear. Garden, make bad pottery, I don't care, but you will not do business here again." He stood. "You have 24 hours. Damon didn't need one. He had already lost. They walked out without gloating. Quiet victory suits people who know how loud defeat is. Hope settled over the mansion that night with an exhale. Loss curled up at the foot of the bed. The war was over. There were new battles always, but the thing that had brought them together was done. The contract might as well have been smoke. Freedom, it turned out, was complicated. If the mission is over, what were they? A week later, Julian found Maya in the music room. She was at the piano but not playing, fingers barely touching the keys as if sound might hurt. "I haven't heard you play in a while," he said from the doorway, soft. "I haven't had much to play about," she said without looking up. He walked in and placed a leather portfolio on the piano. Her stomach dropped. Annulment papers. Of course. A deal fulfilled required a release. She swallowed. "I see," she said, voice choking on its way out. "No," he said gently. "I don't think you do." He turned the document toward her. It wasn't an annulment. It was the deed and incorporation papers for the Pike Langley Foundation, a non-profit, gorgeously endowed, for funding ethical medical research and patient advocacy. Her name sat beside his as co-chair like it had always belonged there. "Profits from my other ventures will fund it," he said, a hopeful energy in him that softened his angles. First project, reopening the cardionics research to isolate the therapeutic gold and throw away the poison. Finish the work your family started. Honor the man I lost. Do it right this time." He looked at her with an earnestness that would have made a different man look weak. "I want to build something that heals, not just fight. I can't do it without you." Tears rose in her eyes like floodwater. He wasn't setting her free because she was a weapon he no longer needed. He was asking her to choose a life with him because he wanted to build, not conquer. "There's one more thing," he said, and for the first time since she'd known him, she heard nerves in his voice. He reached into his pocket, then dropped to one knee like a man who had just remembered how to pray. He took her hand. His fingers were trembling. "Maya Langley," he said, voice thick. "Our marriage began as the worst sort of bargain. A contract carved out of desperation. A lie." He looked up, pain and hope mixed in his eyes until you couldn't tell where one ended. "I want a chance to make it the truth. I want to spend my life building with you and fixing with you. I love you more than I thought I knew how." He opened a small velvet box. Inside, a diamond that didn't shout. It shone like it knew secrets. "Will you marry me? For real this time? No contracts, no clauses, just you and me." The yes lived in her bones before it found her mouth. Tears spilled, grateful and bright. She nodded so hard a laugh broke through. "Yes," she whispered. Then, louder, laughing and crying at once, "Yes, Julian, I'll marry you." Their second wedding was the antidote to the first. Sunlight poured into the garden at Cross Manor like blessing. No press, no shareholders, just people with hands that knew how to hold and eyes that knew how to soften. Wilson Langley, color in his cheeks and steadiness in his steps, walked Maya down an aisle lined with flowers that smelled like home. At the altar he placed her hand in Julian's and turned to the man who had been his enemy. "You saved my life," Wilson said, voice thick with gratitude that had little to do with artery walls. "And your daughter," Julian replied softly, looking at Maya like she was the cure to everything anyone was trying to sell. "Saved mine." They shook hands not as adversaries, not as debtor and savior, but as family. Across the aisle, Vivian Cross watched her son like a woman who hadn't let herself relax in decades. Her rare, genuine smile was small, but it remade her face. She had been the first person he told, the first person to whom he'd admitted his heart had outrun his head. "It's about time," she'd said. "That girl is the best thing you've ever done." Approval wasn't a hurdle anymore. It was a foundation stone. The reception was dinner on the terrace as the day exhaled into gold. Conversation flowed. Laughter didn't have edges. Vivian, to everyone's shock, became animated as Maya unfurled ideas for the Foundation's first community outreach program. Mobile clinics in neighborhoods no one was used to visiting, partnerships with local faith centers and union halls, funding for a patient advocacy hotline. Wilson and Julian, once on opposite ends of a war, found common ground in an argument about the future of pharmaceutical ethics that turned into excited agreement and some gentle teasing that looked suspiciously like friendship. When it was time for a toast, Julian stood, glass in hand, shadow long across the lawn but voice clear. "To second chances," he said, "to truth in the middle of lies, and to strength born from our weakest places. To love turning enemies into family, to the families we're born into and the families we get to choose." The air changed. Peace is a thing you can sometimes feel on your skin. Hope blew in and sat with them. Loss took a step back and let other things speak. 1 year later, the master bedroom wasn't in the West Wing. The invisible wall had been not just moved, it had been demolished. The room belonged to them. Maya's touches softened the edges. A stack of art books with dog-eared pages by the bed. A woven throw that looked like morning light. A vase of poppies that made the room smell like summer. The city glittered outside like a favorite necklace. Inside, everything was warm and quiet. Maya sat on the edge of the bed in one of Julian's white shirts. It swallowed her and made her look like a study in serenity. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her, chin on her shoulder, breath wandering over her collarbone. His hand lifted, tracing the faint, silvery line near her right shoulder, the small scar that had started everything and led them here. "It's still here," he whispered, lips brushing skin. "Yes," she said, smiling. She tilted her head and leaned back into him. It's a reminder. Of the danger? He asked softly. Of the lies? Of what I did? No. She turned in his arms, took his hand, and placed it on her stomach. It was gently, beautifully rounded, a promise with a heartbeat. It reminds me that sometimes our deepest scars are the compass that points us exactly where we need to go. He looked into her eyes and fell into them as if he'd never known falling could feel like rest. Then he glanced down at his hand, spread over their future. The calculating mind that had once prided itself on seeing every angle and the surgeon's hands that had once been trained on repair understood, finally, what victory looked like. It wasn't a boardroom. It wasn't an acquisition. It was here. It was her. It was them. He kissed her, slow and sure, gratitude and promise woven into something language couldn't catch. He had set out to stop a poison and found a cure he had never known he needed, and it would last their whole lives, long after headlines forgot their names and buildings forgot their shadows. In the garden below, the poppies opened, red as joy. The city breathed. The house, finally home, hummed a new song. The soft, steady rhythm of hope kept, loss forgiven, hope again. And then the sweetest thing anyone ever reaches for, breakthrough.